back to Bio with Mr. Brown. In today's video, we will be discussing evidence for evolution, or how do we know that evolution exists. In class, we've already talked about some common misconceptions about evolution and some important people who aided in our understanding of evolution. So without further ado, grab your writing utensils and guided note packet, and let's begin. Evolution. To begin our study in evolution, we must talk about a pretty important guy, Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was a naturalist who set sail in the 19th century to study the world around him. During his travels, Darwin collected evidence that led him to propose the theory of evolution. He observed that the characteristics of many animals and plants varied noticeably among the different Galapagos Islands, which was a place where he studied at. He observed that the characteristics of these animals and plants and concluded that they must derive from a common ancestor. He later published his findings in The Origins of Species and became known as the father of evolution. It's the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. As mentioned, Darwin is considered the father of evolution. He was the first one to publish scientific evidence supporting the process. Let's look at some of Darwin's points. Organisms differ. Variation is inherited, which means that different organisms pass down different things to their offspring. And when it comes to offspring, organisms produce more offspring than can survive, which means not all offspring survive, and this can be due to a variety of factors such as illness or disease, or there may even be competition for resources, like interspecific and intraspecific competition, like we talked about in the beginning of the year, and there could be even competition for a mate. Organisms with advantages survive to pass down those advantages to their children. Species alive today are descendant with modification from common ancestors, which simply means that over time, modifications happened that got passed down to us. To think of evolution as a change in the population of organisms over time. Evolution is a slow process that takes many generations to happen. It involves the passing down of more favorable traits to organisms and the getting rid of less advantageous traits. There are 4 pieces of evidence that support evolution that we are going to talk about. These pieces of evidence include fossils, comparative anatomy and structures, embryology, and biochemistry, which takes in consideration an organism's proteins and DNA. That we're going to explore is fossil record. Fossil record refers to fossils, which are the preserved remains or traces of an organism that is no longer living. So how can we use fossils to determine the age of something? The first way we can do it is through relative dating. And relative dating compares the depth of fossils. So if you look at the image on your right of your screen, you will see stacks of fossils. The lower layers of this stack are representing the older fossils, while the layers that are closer to the top are those that are younger. So relative dating is a type of dating that allows us to simply estimate how old an object could be by comparing it to the layers around it. Absolute dating is a second type of method that is a more specific type of dating that involves chemically testing fossils with radioactive isotopes. These radioactive isotopes can be like carbon-14, uranium-235, or thorium-232. The main point of these isotopes are to help detect them, and how they do that is that they start to disappear the longer they have been around. So we can look at the amount of it in a substance and use it to calculate the date when something was last alive. Additionally, fossils are very useful to us in the field of science because they can tell us how organisms have appeared, disappeared, and have changed over time. which helps gives us information about the extinction of species or what may have caused them to go extinct. Fossil records also gives us information about ancient climates and environmental conditions. That's how we know that the same climate that we are experiencing today is not necessarily the same climate that may have existed 50 or even 100 years ago. Fossil records also indicates development of life from simple to complex. If we take a look at the image, we see that 545 million years ago, animals were a lot more simpler than they are today. All right. And as we move up in this younger relative dating or move up to years that are closer to us, life starts to get more complex. Fossil records also help us understand that life began in water with very, 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 very tiny, simple organisms. Used in studying evolution is comparative anatomy. In comparative anatomy, we are looking at anatomical structures to find similarities and differences. One of the structures that we can look at is called homologous structures. And homologous structures refers to parts with similar basic structures but different functions. So if you look at the image on your screen, you will see a basic structure that has a different function in organisms. For instance, you will see a human, cat, whale, and bat, arm, leg, fin, and wing. All of these structures are made up of the same components, in this case bones, but the structure has a different function. Humans use this appendage to grab or reach, cats to walk or run, whales to swim, and bats to fly. By it being made up of the same things, this shows us that this structure has evolved from a common ancestor with a basic version of that structure. Analogous structures are structures that have the same function but are made differently. The wings of bats and insects are very different materials. Bats are made of skin and insects are made of chitin, but they have a similar function. This shows that these organisms independently evolved and have structures that serve the same purpose. Independent evolution happens as a need to adapt to the environment. Vestigial structures are another type of comparative anatomy that we can look at. And vestigial structures, they refer to parts that have little to no function, but probably used to be helpful. This shows body parts that are from a previous ancestor. These inherited structures might not be needed in a different situation. For example, we have an appendix, which was a structure that aided in digestion of tough herbivorous foods. Now that our diet is not really plant based, or we're not eating tough to break down plant material, the appendix is not as useful anymore. And people can have the appendix removed and live a normal, healthy life. Goosebumps are another example which were used as a defense mechanism that caused our hair to puff out and make us look bigger. Now that we don't have as many predators, this structure isn't as useful anymore. Another example that you may be more familiar with is our tonsils. Tonsils are a vestigial structure that help fight off bacteria that can enter through the nose and mouth. Due to the increase in modern medicine, tonsils can be removed and a person can understand live normally. Evolution is embryology, which refers to the stages of development before the birth of an organism. So, embryology is the pattern of embryological development. So, if you look at the image to your right, you will see a couple of different organisms depicted. You'll see a fish, turtle, chicken, pig, and human. And as these organisms progress throughout their embryological development, we see similar patterns of development. This indicates that a common ancestry is shared. Last and final piece of evidence we have for understanding evolution is biochemistry, which takes into account the proteins, RNA, and DNA molecules making up an organism. We learned that DNA is the universal genetic code and that the traits in DNA are passed down, which can cause evolution. Examining evolution through the lens of biochemistry also requires us to look at the similarity of genetic molecules. The more closely related organisms are, the more similar the biochemical makeup, which indicates a common ancestor. If you take a look at the image of the human and the fly, you will see that we have a pretty common or similar genetic code. Even though you wouldn't be able to tell by looking at us, this lets us know that many millions of years ago, we likely had a common ancestor. This lets us understand how the universal rules of DNA and genetic code support evolution. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. If there is something that you missed or forgot to fill in, please rewind the video so that you can get that information. Also, please be sure to finish your practice questions at the end of your guided notes. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Have a great evening.